Hello everyone. Welcome to part 4 on the historical Christ, which will be revealed. Now, Christ was born at a very particular time when there was a certain alignment. He was expected. What do we make of this? Well, actually, all astrological stock traders, and there are astrologists in the stock market as well, know that astrology rules the markets. And that is because sunspots rule the markets. This is because the sun ripens crops. No crops, no economy, nothing to trade with, no tax, nothing to pay the armies with. The barbarians up north get cold as the sun goes out and they march in because the sun does vary over the centuries. That's how it happened. As the sun declined and changed colour, the Roman Empire fell. There was a solar maximum at the time of Christ, so he was the sun ruler. The ancients probably knew about solar maximums and tied it into millennial or half-millennial cycles, which is where millenarianism comes from in the first place. 1,000 years ago, the sun was as strong as today, and the economy was so good that ridiculously large cathedrals were built across Europe. Bit of a coincidence that around the year 0, 1,000 years before that, this was the height of the empire and rebirth of history. This is why empires tend to last 1,000 years, or they hope to last 1,000 years. In this way, Jesus was already expected to live around a certain time. It was forecast in advance that great rulers would appear at certain times of the solar cycle. Ideas found in the writing of Arabic Albumasar, who took it from an earlier tradition, with cycles of kings occurring and recurring. Hence the idea of wise philosophers from the East predicting all this. In Albumasar's writings, you can read it all for yourself, and in his predecessor Al-Kindi, but I fear most of his stuff is still in Latin. We have a lot of ancient texts which were translated into Latin centuries ago, but then never into English. So the birth of someone great around the year 0 was actually expected for centuries. Now, the Bible also talks astrology and alignments. Listen to this. There will be great earthquakes, famines and pestilences in various places, and fearful events and great signs from heaven. Now, you might recognize that. That's in the New Testament. That's Luke 21:11. So there you go. Astrology and basically it's mundane astrology. I wouldn't call it fortune telling, but it's mundane astrology in the Bible. Now, the Bible clearly therefore incorporates an earlier tradition, which included a prediction for the rise of Christianity, which would have been initially used as a justification by early Christians for what they were up to, but it was surely later expunged because astrology is not really looked upon that well, but it's clearly a mark of that. Now, I think there is something to so-called astrology, which is actually just a form of astronomy and repeating patterns. In any repeating pattern caused by circular motion, we have the conservation of information. The universe is just information. And it's information at a very fine level that is unappreciated in physics. Horoscope astrology is a little weird and hard to grasp, but that's actually a Greek offshoot, also from the Babylonians. It is mundane astrology of planets affecting weather, the rise and fall of kings and civilizations over millennia. That is at least a bit more scientifically provable and acceptable, and therefore easier to grasp. Note that the most effective Roman emperor ever, Augustus, also lived in the time of supposed Christ, 2 emperors at a time of maximum plenty. Now, one day I will write about this in a book, but to be brief, I believe the sun is partly electrical and powered by the galaxy, as the plasma cosmologists envisage. Not sure if it's been suggested before, but I think a relic of the plasma cable linking it to the galaxy is actually the outer gas giant, once conductive of electricity and plasma in form like an umbilical cord. And what you're about to hear is a brand new theory. When they align or disalign, particularly involving Saturn or Jupiter, we have solar maxima and other phenomena because the cable as it was, is reconstituted. That will be in an upcoming book, I hope. Now, what happened at the time of Christ? There was a grand alignment of the gas giants known as a Great Conjunction. There you go. It happens every 20 years. But when it happens in conjunction with an alignment of the other planets, or in a particular constellation, it's much more rare and looked upon as a great sign. And this is one reason why that particular time was selected as the year zero, some kind of solar cycle. But there must also have been a figure, a person who lived around this time, who is to be identified with the good Jesus or Jesus Christ. The three wise men were also astrologers, but also they were Hermes Trismegistus, rising in the east as if they were a planet approaching from the east, or a planetary alignment of three planets. That's probably what the Star of Jerusalem was. Christianity fit into Sol Invictus worship, because Christians could say to Sol worshippers, hey, you worship Sol rising in the east, you have Easter, east facing, you face the east when you pray. Well, guess what? We too worship a sun, and he has only just risen in the east. You see, it just totally fits. Now, early Christians were an interesting lot. They needed to immediately create a religious structure in order to legitimize their worship. And the quickest way to do this was firstly to immediately appoint bishops and lower downs, such as presbyters and others, all over the place in order to create a hierarchy. They perhaps realized that powerful people are immediately attracted to hierarchies, and this would give them protection. In addition, they adopted ideas direct from Mithraism and Sol worship. It seems to me that early Christians had an information deficit. They didn't actually know too much about their new religion. I mean, we still don't know very much about it. It's a mystery. St. Paul realized this was an issue to be overcome. He solved this by saying, you only need to believe and you will be given eternal life. He hardly said a thing or even seems to have known what Christ was all about. Thomas Jefferson said Paul was the first corrupter of Christ's teachings. The ankh and fish were already Hamitic symbols from the Baal religion practiced around the empire. The Baal religion, Baal meaning Lord, was already a kind of monotheism. It's the religion of the pillar. You see it in St. Peter's Square. It must have been associated with Sol Invictus with a pyramidion on top. So this religion was quickly incorporated. The fish and the cross were meanwhile, to my knowledge, not really symbols from Judea. So again, we have a direction away from the four sects of Judaism and Judea. Traditionally, one of them was associated with Jesus, but I've never believed that. It just doesn't fit. And the four sects, as described by Josephus, they were the Zealots, invented by Judas the Zealot around the year 0, also called Judas the Galilean, responsible for the anti-Rome wars later on in the 60s. The Sadducees, who were materialists and practical. The Pharisees, who were basically Stoics. And the Essenes, who believed in an immortal soul. Now, St. Paul was surely Essene-ish, but was Christ? Well, I don't think so, and it's never been convincing for me, but maybe. If you want to see what these sects were all about, I recommend only the Josephus definitions of these Judea sects, which is what I'm using, or maybe Philo, or else the result is, instead of comprehension, a splitting headache. Now, the early Christians knew they wanted ritual also, but they didn't really know what kind of ritual. So if you look up a fascinating text called The Apostolic Tradition of Hippolytus of Rome, you can see some interesting things. We don't know when it was written, either the 200s or around 400. The text actually tells us, 1, some reasons why early Christians were hated, and 2, that early Christians didn't really have a mass. They had a kind of feasting prayer ritual. It's true. I think there was one mass which was Mithra-like, and another Christian mass which was similar to a synagogue ritual, and depending on what part of the empire you were in is what sort of mass you had. Firstly, from reading this, 1, it's a little confusing, but the text seems to describe either who may join the Christian hierarchy or who may become a Christian, full stop. And Hippolytus actually writes, if you're a soldier, you won't be a good Christian, as you will kill people. He says if you paint any picture or make a sculpture, you're an idolater and we don't want you either. That is any picture. I mean, any image. It's easy to see why this went against the grain of the Roman way of life, and Edward Gibbon had to conclude that Christians were hated because they seemed to have in them a universal hatred for mankind. And please understand, I am talking early Christians, talking history, not current Christianity, because if you look at the comments and some people, they do get offended. And now, so I don't discuss religion in its current form. If you talk religion or politics or sex with anyone, you get not just hate, you get war. And I've certainly found that in my own life. So we only discuss the formative spread of Christianity here. 2. What is mass? Well, it comes from mitto, which means I send. If you dismiss someone, you start to miss them, because it literally means in Latin that you have sent them away. But if you're missing them, you will also send for them. So you literally say I miss them. That means I have sent for them. Therefore, a mass is a sending of prayers, and this would be the only reason why it would be held. Of course, the Christians needed something to compete with the Sabbaths and the Sunday worship, so masses had to fall on the Sunday to either pull away soul worshippers or incorporate them. I mean, why do all the Dark Ages and later churches face directly the solstice sun? That's what I've noticed in Ireland. Not the sun rising on the day of a saint, as later churches, but the solstice sun. It's because early liturgies must have incorporated some kind of morning solar veneration. Look when Mass is. It's just early in the morning on a Sunday. Rather interesting. So for the next 1,000 years thereafter, masses were held as a kind of social occasion to meet people, but also to reaffirm a pact with God. But the original reason is betrayed by the name sending. It is to send prayers, and organised in a kind of Mithraic holy feasting justified by the Last Supper of the Gospels. That's what it was, I think. Which was a kind of... and of course, the Last Supper in the Gospels was itself Passover. A kind of Jewish form of the Easter worship. I recall, as a Catholic, I was always a little disappointed with the Catholic Mass, as it appears to be a kind of feast with a table laid, with a white cloth, a kind of celebration, and yet it is more of a dialogue, or more often a monologue, yet the food is always nothing too significant, a wafer. Of course, this all stems from the body of the Lord. Now, Lord, that's a loaded term, being bull or Baal. You sacrifice a bull, there is bloodletting, which is the wine. It comes from bull worship. If you read the Iliad, you will see an earlier version of this. You will see the Achaeans have their own kind of mass, which is a feasting on cattle over a fire. To worship their Lord, they wrap the inedible fat around sticks and burn them so that God too can participate by inhaling the smoke. Another form of bull worship is still practiced in India, of course, in which case the cow is a holy spirit and cannot be molested. Eradicated on the continent of Europe long ago, it survived on the peripheries. So if you were in Spain, you would have a bull games in which you would kill the bull, or the bull would kill you. If you were in Crete, the bull would certainly kill you and not the other way around, but you had a choice. If you got out of the maze, maybe you would live. Plato writes that some lost Atlantic island, Atlantis, worshipped the bull. Spilling its blood on the sacred pillar was part of their ritual, and that's surely Baal worship, and that's being associated by Plato with Atlantis. The bull religion was everywhere, but in different forms. The bull was Lord. It's a wonder the horns did not become Christian symbols, because the blood clearly did, incorporated into the new religion. So if you read this text by Hippolytus, it's interesting. The so-called liturgy is a kind of celebration. The author clearly specifies that fruits may be blessed. He specifies which ones. He talks about figs and other fruits. But he says no vegetables may be blessed. Fruit in Latin is fructus, which also means delight. So it's celebrating the delights of the earth. So we all know the Romans feasting on grapes. Was that a Christian ritual as well? Feasting on the grapes, the fruit? I mean, I find that all rather interesting. That was a part of Christianity, but it is obviously no longer in Christian Mass. Now, speaking in tongues is also something that early Christians got up to. It's in the Bible, but what can it have been? I just refuse to believe it was a type of channeling, or then it would be mistaken for demonic possession, would it not? I think it was something like you see in the early Christian Egyptian Nag Hammadi texts. In this, there are various weird texts which you are presumably to recite out loud as a sort of prayer in which you make strange vowel noises, but it's all very odd. I think it was also simply reading out texts in other languages. I think maybe the early sayings of Christ from the Gospel of Thomas. For example, the Catholic Mass until the 20th century was often done in Latin, which was seen as hocus pocus by reformists during the Reformation. I mean, isn't that a form of speaking in tongues? Tongue means language rather than tongue twister and speaking babble. Or does it? We don't really know. Of course, people would get excited to be speaking in the original language and mix it with some wine, and suddenly you have a recipe for riotous behaviour. The text by Hippolytus actually says that if you're invited to someone's home, don't drink in excess or you will end up offending and be hated. Now, why would it say that? I mean, did they drink too much? I've witnessed this in the last month. Respectable adults, kind people, in fact elders, leaders of organisations, really respectable people who can't hold their liquor, becoming incredibly insulting, not knowing when to stop, turning almost demonic in their insulting behaviour, wanting to somehow, for some reason, keep drinking until they go bananas, because drinking is a chain reaction. So I really don't blame them for doing prohibition, even though alcohol can be fun. So many friendships have been ended just from having a party. So, does this early Christian liturgy talk about the sayings of Christ? What does it really say about Christ? Well, not much at all. It doesn't mention his sayings. Why would it? It's simply following the St. Paul creed of believing in someone who rose in the East and wanted to save us. That's what Christianity had already become. Was it original Christianity? Well, we will find out. So join us, please, for the next thrilling episode. I've found someone I think is the historical Christ, lived in the right time, died at the right age, persecuted by Pontius Pilate. He ticks all the boxes. Yes, of course he was real. And it's different to what we know. Researching is just so much fun because you can turn up so much stuff that people aren't otherwise aware of. We're going to expose the truth behind Pilate's conspiracy against the historical Jesus, what actually went on. It really was a calculated conspiracy to prevent rebellion. And this Christ was not from Judea, so therefore he wasn't really an Essene or a Saduccee or a Pharisee or a Zealot. But loosely you could see he was Jewish because he would have been brought up in a similar way. I'd love to share this with you. I am a historian by training, so this is total pleasure for me. I hope it is for you too. Lots of fun. We will get onto the historical contenders pretty soon. Some popular new books have also appeared, I've noticed, in the last 10 years, saying he was a zealot, saying he was possibly mistaken for the first zealot, who was a guy called Judas the Galilean. Judas the Galilean story was rewritten, or he was this, or he was that. Nope. I think they are all wrong because the real guy is just too much like the actual Christ to pass up. And these other guys clearly have their own separate existence, agendas, and traits which distinguish them from Jesus. Jesus was somewhat different. Now, the real guy, he did try to become, the guy I think is the real guy, did try to become a kind of king or leader. And I think this is the guy, this is the one. He was, believe it or not, an archaeologist. And he needed certain artifacts to get some credibility and pedigree behind him. Very particular artifacts which we will have to look into. Pontius Pilate saw what was happening and he swooped. Because, you see, he also wanted to get to the treasure. He wanted to get to it first because Pilate was a very greedy guy. So it was just like, basically in the movies, the evil guy swoops in at the end and tries to take the treasure. That is exactly what happened in reality. He was awful. So it was actually a treasure hunt, and the Jews were after their literal national treasure to justify their existence and heritage. I mean, isn't reality more unbelievable than fiction? And that's the way it always is. The irony is today we search for treasures associated with Christ, such as the Holy Grail and other artifacts, when in fact he may have been a treasure hunter. Pilate worked with the temple Jews to sabotage everything, but the gospel version is kind of skewed away from the facts and all this. I finally decided that this must be the one. This must be the same guy as Jesus, simply by weighing the probabilities against the other contenders. He can't really not be him, but people ignore him because he isn't quite what everyone is expecting and the information is incomplete. Now, I'm going to tell you the story that has never been told, the true story based on research, and it's all backed up by historical sources, totally. It's so obvious, but people just aren't seeing what's literally presented on a silver platter before them. But there might also have been one or two Jesuses soon after him, and it's totally confused things. But there is no longer any doubt in my mind whatsoever that the Jesus that I'll present was the one for sure. The others who followed were imitators, and later, who could really tell which was which? I mean, there was no internet, there were hardly any books, no one could check. I mean, Pilate literally told this guy, you want the crown jewelry, do you? I'll give you the crown. You want to be king of the Jews? Okay, I'll give you king of the Jews. It's the least I can do. Really evil guy. Now, I tend to keep my promises, so stay tuned, it's going to be awesome. Bye.